Everybody for tuning in this afternoon. We really appreciate the opportunity to share some of the changes that our counseling department has gone through over the last year. And I also would like to take a chance to thank both Stephanie and Fatima for their input on this presentation. A lot has gone into this, both in terms of the presentation itself, but also the change leading up to it. So without further ado, I guess we'll just get started. So bear with us. Well, there's three of us crammed in a very small room here at York, so we're very close to one another, and we're coordinating, clicking, and things at the same time. And Stephanie's going to monitor the questions as they come in, and so we'll hopefully get a chance to sort of answer those in real time as well. So you can see there the agenda for this afternoon. We're going to talk a little bit about student counseling and development, and to us that's known as SCD. It's just easier to say. So you'll be hearing us refer to SCD as opposed to student counseling and development. We're going to start by talking a little bit about our historical model of service delivery, and I think it's probably something most universities can relate to. And then we'll talk about the change that we piloted last December, where we started our walk-in counseling model. And then we'll talk more about our current service delivery model and what that looks like, no longer called a pilot. And Stephanie's going to spend some time talking about data collection, because that's an integral part of how we made the change and how we continue to move forward. And then we'll also talk about continued improvement and some final takeaways for anybody who's interested in following suit in terms of implementing walk-in counseling models.
Yeah, I also had mentioned to Perlin prior to the webinar, but just to reiterate again for folks who might have just joined us, Lori was gracious enough to approve these slides to be sent out. So for anybody who might be rushing to take down a note or two, just feel free to follow along, and you'll have access to the slides after as well. Yeah.
Okay. So I thought it was important that we just start with our mission statement. I think most universities have something similar, but for us, the last point there that's highlighted in a yellow kind of a color, that's really our guiding principle. So when we were thinking about moving to a walk-in model and change, we really use this to guide the scope of what we do. So all of the decisions we've made for implementation and around service delivery are related to thinking about what students need to get through their university experience, given that they're here and that's their main purpose for being here. So for us, we sort of have three pieces to the mandate of our counseling center, and that's obviously direct service to students. And all students on the Kiel campus, because we have a bilingual program on the Glendon campus, but all students on our Kiel campus are eligible for counseling services that are currently enrolled in courses. And our services are funded by ancillary fees, so there's no fees to students. The second sort of main activity that we undertake is consultation and outreach to faculty and staff. So we do lots of things like tabling at events, presentations to staff, around what our services are, as well as consulting with faculty or staff that are struggling with students in distress. Then the third really important piece of our program is the counseling practicum. So we bring on graduate students from various fields of social work, psychotherapy, and psychology, and we provide training around counseling. So when we started on our change process, one of the things that we did is we got together as a counseling team and we brainstormed what our departmental values were. So again, where we show you this just because all of our decisions, we go back to this slide to think about how what we're doing is representative through these values. So when we make decisions, we make sure that we're aligned with who we are as a counseling team. So a little bit about the historical intake model, that's what we're referring to it as. So most of our campus partners and the counseling center itself really worked on what's called a crisis counseling model. So we were really known as a crisis center, as well as providing ongoing counseling to clients. So just to walk you through of what the process looked like in the past, a student had to physically come into our counseling center and request an appointment. At that time, they were given an appointment to come back. We aspirationally said 7 to 10 days, but as most of you know, as the semester goes on and things get busy, that timeline tended to stretch a bit. But aspirationally, students showed up again in 7 to 10 days, and then they were met with somebody that we called an intake counselor. So we had dedicated staff that was their job title, and all they did was intake appointments. It was a fairly in-depth process. It took about an hour. Went through the client's history and gathered a very in-depth and holistic picture of the student and what their needs were. From there, those files were brought to what we call disposition, or to our crisis counseling teams, and they decided the best fit, who amongst the staff had room on their wait list and things like that. And so a student was either picked up if that was possible, or in most cases, they ended up being placed on a wait list. We talked about delivering short-term therapy. I think, aspirationally, again, we kind of worked in an 8 to 10 session framework, but we often exceeded that framework, and those parameters were not something that we messaged wisely to the York community. But internally, we sort of had some parameters that said, 20 sessions per academic term, or sorry, per degree. And so again, those were pretty loose, and they often exceeded that. So students who were placed on the wait list were often sat anywhere between 3 and 12 weeks. And when Stephanie talks more about the data, you'll see some of those exact figures. So when I came on board, so I joined York's team last August 2018. So it's just one whole year since I've been here. And so when I took the position, it was really my intention to spend the first year just listening and learning and talking to people and understanding the needs of the York community. And one of the first things that I did was talk to all of the counselors, both informally and formally, and really wanted to get their understanding of what some of the issues were, what was working well, areas that they thought needed changed. And it certainly fell into sort of 3 main themes. And most of you in counseling centers can probably relate to these themes. So staff talked to me a lot about caseload equity. There was a perception that some staff were doing a lot more than others, and that, of course, led to staff morale issues. Because we had such a huge wait list and we were seeing so many clients walking in, staff morale was a problem, because often staff were seeing 6 or 7 clients a day in some cases. And I think there was just generally a sense of people feeling really burnt out. And I've certainly heard from my counterparts at other universities that that's a similar concern in their areas as well. The other thing that we did was Stephanie was a position that we were able to create, the data policy analyst position, which I think is pretty unique to us. It's a position that I brought with me from my team in government, and so it was actually a new position. We had to create a job spec, and since Stephanie's come on board, we've had lots of people inquire about what that is and can they borrow her job spec, and in some cases ask to borrow Stephanie. So Stephanie's first task when she joined York, our team here, was to do an evaluation of our internship program. At the time, we had 15 interns that were here with us in that year, and so we spent a lot of time talking to them about their experiences of both the historical model, but they were also here when we changed our model. So we talked a lot about what that change and the impact that that change was like for them. So we had that perspective as well. And then we had the operational sort of processes that we evaluated, and we heard from staff things about standardizing departmental processes. There were lots of staff that were new versus staff that had been here for many, many years, and so there was different messaging around how we were doing things. Somebody would say, well, I got this email, I didn't get that email, I thought we made this decision. And we didn't really have any of this information in any kind of standardized, centralized place. So that was a pretty important task that we had to undertake. And we didn't have very good data collection. And I would say as we go through this that you'll hear that data is the driving force behind our decisions and key to any kind of successful change, at least from my perspective. So when we decided to change our walk-in model, it was really, because I just want to be transparent with everybody, this was not, I spent months and months thinking this through, collaborating, talking, being critical. This was a decision that came partly out of frustration and partly when I would see the faces of my staff and I would look at the 150 students on our wait list. We just, in my opinion, I felt like the center was drowning and we needed to do something. And so we literally had a few meetings and just ripped the Band-Aid off and decided we were just going to go for it. And we did. And so again, there is not a lot of prep. We didn't have a lot of training. Fortunately, most of the staff had some experience with single session solution-focused counseling, so we were able to draw on that. And then we just, like I said, we really went for it. So we started with a very high level kind of a framework. We didn't have a lot in writing to work from. And this is what we came up with for our pilot, which we started last December. So the purpose, to provide students immediate access to a qualified counseling professional in a safe and positive space. So that was our guiding force, and then the rest sort of fell out from there. So what the process for our pilot really looked like was a student arrived at our center, they walked in the door and they were seen within about a half an hour. We changed our paperwork significantly. So you recall I said we had an hour-long in-depth intake interview. We changed that paperwork to about 4 questions that really narrowed the focus of what the students were doing here. It wasn't historical at all in nature. We weren't asking about things from the past, and we were really focused on the here and now, what worked for them and what they needed to go forward. From there, they met with a counselor for approximately 15 minutes. I will, in all honesty, say that it's often longer than that, and there's leeway in our current model for clinicians to have clinical judgment about how long that person needs to be here. And in that session, and this is really the crux of any kind of a walk-in model, it's a very collaborative, it's very concrete and tangible. And so it really is becoming very good at listening to what's the most important thing to deal with today, and then working collaboratively to create next steps. What's the first thing that you can do, that you can commit to get you moving in the right direction? So a very important part of that session is working with the student to get a commitment from them about the things that they need to do going forward. So for us, we really see it as a student empowerment type of a model. So the student is welcome to return. So we didn't put limits on how many times a student could return. So we say single session, not single utilization. But we have taken steps, and you'll see as we go forward to really sort of define what that looks like. So again, it's our hope that from the next step sheet, the student goes away and is really empowered to make the decisions they need to move forward. But if not, if a different problem arises, or what the next step sheet or the next steps that they collaborated on isn't working for them, they can definitely come back and see us. And I just wanted to also say, so part of our paperwork, although it's quite, we've shortened it considerably, they do a demographic sheet, so that helps us take data. And then they do that intake paperwork, which again was about 4 questions, but they also do a depression and anxiety standardized questionnaire. So you'll see at the bottom the GAD and the PHQ-9. And that I'll explain a little bit later as part of a referral and a memorandum of understanding and a partnership we have with Ontario Shores. So I've been mentioning a lot about our next step sheet. So this is the sheet, and this is literally what it looks like. It's a document, and often in the session, the counselors get the student to fill it out, and by asking things like what really resonated with you about all the things that we've talked about, what do you think you can commit to? And I think if you look at the bottom part, or the part that's up front, you'll see that these are what we did at the bottom. These are the most common recommendations. And I think also you'll notice that if you're thinking about ongoing counseling, some of the things that that are included at the beginning of ongoing relationships are some psychoed, and then also putting some foundational pieces in place to get that ongoing relationship started. So you'll see that some of our main referrals are attending a skills workshop that we put on for the students. There's the bounce back videos, there's process groups, which are counseling groups, and LGBTQ plus support group. Lots of recommendations to accessibility services, go to your doctor, get checked out, sign up for some skills building workshops, those kinds of things, which I think are probably standard recommendations by most universities. But really all we've done is take these pieces out of the ongoing relationship and move them into, let's put these places in first before we sort of entertain the idea of ongoing counseling. So that's what the next step sheet looks like. Students either take a picture of it or they get a copy of it and they take it with them when they leave.
And if I just want to add in a point that there's also opportunities with the next step sheet to add in themes that speak to whatever is discussed in the session. So things like notice when anxiety comes up, or if there's a discussion around the psychoed with anxiety, let's say, for example, and the counselors perhaps looking at the way that anxiety might manifest on a physical level. There might be just a next step around observe when anxiety comes up in the body. So there's ways that we kind of try to combine the practical piece, but also speak to maybe themes or just therapeutic pieces in the session as well.
So this next part, so one of the operational challenges with a walk-in model is how to arrange staff. So if you recall from the historical model that we used to have, our staff were arranged in crisis teams. So you were either on a team and you saw people that were being walked over in crisis or came in crisis, so you weren't scheduling ongoing clients on that day. So that model was already in place. So when we switched to our walk-in model, we already had teams arranged. We just had to do some fancy scheduling. These are not, by the way, the names of our counselors. These are fake names that Stephanie's made up. So, but this is essentially what a walk-in schedule looks like. So what it kind of breaks down to is we have 6 counselors on call every day to do walk-in, and they're dedicated to walk-in. What we did is we made projections using the data that we had, historical data, again, which is very difficult because the model was, it had intake, crisis, ongoing. We didn't have any walk-in model data to go by, so we had to make some projections and some, somewhat educated guesses about how many students we would be dealing with. But so one of the things that we did was we were able to sort of ascertain that we were probably dealing with about 12 to 15 walk-ins a day, which is why we set the number at 3 clients per day per staff member. And also, again, a little bit later, I'll talk about when we talk about some of the challenges around implementation. Staff, you may recall I said we're feeling really burnt out. And so we recognize that changing to a walk-in model is difficult, and that single sessions are often difficult and more difficult than an ongoing relationship because you don't know what you're getting and you have to be prepared. And there's not a lot of, you don't have that relationship to draw from and goodwill with your client and all of those things. So sometimes the single sessions can be quite draining and difficult to prepare for. So in recognition of that, we set the cap for counselors at 3 per day, which allowed us to see up to 18 clients. Having said that, we also knew that we have some peak times of the year, which you all are also familiar with. Again, anecdotally, we thought September was our busiest time, but when we went back and looked at the data, we knew that actually October and November, and then again in February, March are the busiest times of the year. So you might have noticed that when we were talking about our internship program or our student practicum program, in the past, we had those extra 15 bodies to help with our staffing complement, which gave us a complement of 30 staff total to work with. But we decided to take a 1-year hiatus from the internship program. So when we moved forward with our walk-in model, we were down essentially 15 staff, and we had to account for that when we were planning for this year. So you'll see on this sheet under the notes section that I have 6 of my permanent staff working every day on that on-call team. And then in those peak periods, so for instance, October and November for this semester, we actually hired 3 walk-in counselors in a 2-month contract. And so we're actually able to see service up to 27 clients a day, and sometimes more than that if we need to. We will draw from our other staff that are seeing ongoing clients that maybe had cancellations or no-shows or have the availability to jump into the on-call team. So that was a bit of an experiment as well. We didn't know. I mean, I posted a position for 2 months. I really thought nobody would apply, but in fact, what happened was 85 people applied. And so these are people that are qualified registered practitioners that don't need supervision. So I didn't take anybody who needed supervision. I needed them to have walk-in experience, and I needed them to just be able to jump in and do walk-in clients. And it has turned out fantastic. So we had 85 people apply in a day and a half. So anybody who's looking for support during their peak periods, this may be something you want to consider. I didn't think there was a market for it in the clinical community, but it turns out lots of people are interested in gaining experience with emerging adults. So it's it's more popular than I thought, and it's worked out very well for us. So during these peak periods, we have that on-call team has 9 staff on it. Some of the other things that were important pieces to implementation are we don't allow anybody on the on-call team to book their ongoing clients or to do follow-up appointments on that on-call day because they're strictly dedicated to the walk-in clients. Another important piece is you have to plan for how to close your shop at the end of the day. You can't have people walking in right up to 4 o'clock, which is when we close. So we cut off walk-in at 3 o'clock every day. So just a little bit more about how we implemented this. Again, I mentioned that we cut down on the forms of what those intake forms are. I talked about 4 questions. So really the crux of it, what brought you here today? What have you tried in the past to address these concerns, and what are you hoping to get out of today's session? And then we ask if there's anything else the client thinks is important for us to know going into the session. So you can see that that paperwork literally takes about 5 minutes, 15 tops, which is a huge improvement from what our paperwork used to be, which was taking sometimes up to 45 minutes, and it would drive counselors crazy while they were waiting for the paperwork to be filled out. So another really important part of implementation is communication. One of the very big changes for our counselors was pulling back from assuming that every student needed or wanted ongoing counseling. Although I think everybody can find value in ongoing counseling, we also had to go back to that mission statement and say, but students are really here to get an education, and so we have to be respectful of their time constraints and their capacity, right? Because I mean, it takes a lot to get through university. They're often working 1 or 2 jobs. They have social lives, all of those things. And so that's a really important thing to remember is why the students are here and what do they need? How can we support them to get that education? And so pulling back on that messaging and checking our own assumptions as counselors is a really important part of the change in this model. Also, planning for how to meet the demand during peak times is something you need to consider as well. And then data collection. It's something that we do on in a real-time basis. So Stephanie is dedicated to looking at our data, pulling our data. We share it with our clinicians all of the time, and we evaluate and we make real-time change. But part of that means you have to then go through all of your processes and procedures, like updating the labels in your electronic management system or whatever system you're using, and then having a framework. For us, you'll see service delivery framework. That too is updated in real time. If we put something down as a best practice or a way we're doing it and we figure out it doesn't work, we change it in real time. And we, of course, hopefully communicate that well. So some of the challenges, and you know, I've presented this a few times, and what I say is it looks really great in the PowerPoint slides, but in reality, it's been a really tough road that we've traveled. I think it's made us a stronger team, but you know, I think you need to know up front if you're going to embark on this that it's difficult. It's for us, we have a long history of being a counseling center at York and doing business a certain way. And this is a complete, it's like turning the Titanic, essentially. You're asking people to do things differently that they're not used to doing and don't feel comfortable with. And so you'll see there that the first thing that we're talking about is front desk staff. So although it was difficult for our counselors, it's also, there is the burden on your front desk staff or your people, your administrative people, however you have that process, the burden is quite significant on them because they are essential to the walk-in model being successful. So they not only greet students, but they manage the flow of clients, and they manage the clients and the counselor matching. So for us, what that really means is that, you know, if we have 10 people, and this tends to happen, 10 people walk in the door all at once, we have the front desk is monitoring who's being matched with what counselor, when they go in, when they come out, who gets to go for lunch at what time, all of those pieces, which is, again, it can be very, very challenging, but it's the backbone of this model. And so you need to know that you're going to have to spend a lot of time with your front desk staff, teaching them, learning, teaching, supporting them to understand this model and working with them to figure out how best to do that. And also including your staff in that process as well. So staff give me feedback constantly when things have gone a little bit off with our front desk so that we can address it immediately and make sure that we're that front desk is running smoothly, because they really do set the tone for the entire model, both with students and staff. So again, you'll see there that they really do ensure equity between counselors. So we have sort of a batting order, and again, they're monitoring who's where, doing what, and for how long. And they also do the main crux of our data entry and verification as well as filing. So really, really important piece to consider. Again, that staff adapting to the model. We spent our summer, which is quiet for most university counseling centers, but we had staff meetings every day. I'm not kidding on that one. Every day for about 4 hours a day. And we just put it all on the table and we hashed out every single point to the point of people feeling pretty overwhelmed, but at the same time, it was really important for the processing and for people feeling like they had a voice and could buy into the model. You also have to consider things like updating your website, all of your forms and documents, and then how are you going to address the expectation of your community partners? And then how do you help staff deal with the unknowns, the gray areas? Because we can launch a model, but there are so many things that we won't know how it's going to turn out until it actually happens. And so there's a lot of the what do we do if? And so a lot of the role for me as the director is managing those expectations and helping people to just sort of have patience and letting the change happen and letting the data guide us. So in terms of our successes, I think it really allowed us to review the role of the reception desk. We were able to create a reception manual. We were able to draw on some champions. We brought in some in-house training eventually. Again, that didn't happen with our pilot. It happened after, which is also, I know it seems a little counterintuitive, but it also allowed us to know what the model felt like and then have good questions to ask about how do we deal with these situations. We've updated our website. We've been able to have a really solid model and identity to go out and share with our partners. I think one of the things that we did is as the changes were occurring, we had really good communication and ongoing and sort of updating our partners as the changes were happening. So they were involved, even though it was just us communicating, but they were involved. We took their feedback and we were making sure they were aware the whole time that we were moving through the implementation process. For all those gray areas, we sort of upped the number of staff meetings we had. So again, that we could answer questions frequently so that staff weren't having to hold them and sort of stew or ruminate on the what if pieces. So.
Okay, hi everyone. So this is Fatma, and I'm just going to switch over and talk a little bit about staff experience. So Lori hinted to some of the process and the adjustment that we went through while implementing the single session model. So here at SCD, we consist of a team of 15 permanent counselors. As Lori mentioned, we have 3 casual staff, so this is our walk-in counselors. And at this time, we also have 1 psychologist in supervision. I believe that's her title that she's using. So the casual staff and the psychologist in supervision, they attend to the single session. So these are the students that come in and they request for same-day service. As Lori mentioned, permanent counselors, we are assigned twice a week to be on call for the on-call schedule, and that's when we attend to single sessions as well. The other days when we're not on call, that's when we're providing ongoing counseling. Some of us provide group therapy. We're also facilitating the skills workshops and might be involved in other committees. So we come from a very diverse background in terms of training, education, and work experience. Some of us are registered social workers, some of us are registered psychotherapists, psychologists, and lots of different training in terms of how we approach our work in psychotherapy. So some people are well-versed in solution-focused CBT models. Some of us have more training in trauma-informed practices, EFT, emotion-focused therapy. So we're bringing a lot of different diverse perspectives to the work here at SCD. Range in years of services, so some of us have been here for 2 years, others 27 years, so lots of seniority and lots of differences in terms of years of services. So that also speaks to the adjustment process as well. So challenges. So I had the challenge of summarizing this in one slide. So as Lori mentioned, it's been about a year that we've have implemented the walk-in model and the use of the single session. So We've had about a year to kind of, have a good, thorough review of what's working and what's not working. So I guess across the board, a big challenge that comes up is the idea that one size does not fit all, particularly with students that present with trauma histories or complex mental health presentations. We tend to,
Hello? Better?
hello, check?
Yeah, it's on.
Yeah, okay.
You might
So
have
I'm
to
just
back
gonna
up a little
move.
bit.
Okay. So I'll just go back to the first point. So one size does not fit all. So students with trauma histories or complex mental health presentations. I've only worked at York, but I think across the board, staff will all share that we do see a large number of students that do present with complex mental health symptoms and trauma histories, and it can be a challenge when you're meeting someone in a single session to work in the and also being mindful of just other pieces at play in terms of complex histories or complex symptoms. Lack of continuity of care. So as Lori mentioned, this model, we're not assuming that the person needs long-term care, and we're also a big shift and a big challenge is assuming that the person, the student, doesn't necessarily need to see the same person. And this has been a big adjustment, especially for clinicians who are coming from attachment-based trainings or working from a client-centered approach. And sometimes it can be very beneficial if a student is meeting with the same counselor. So that's been a challenge. And it's been a big adjustment piece. Different theoretical orientations, informing practice, and adjustment to single session and brief short-term therapy model. So I kind of already mentioned just that some of us are coming from attachment-based backgrounds in terms of our training. Some of us are coming from trauma-informed perspectives. So some of the training or our experiences have informed that longer-term work tends to be beneficial. So it's been an adjustment in terms of challenging that assumption and looking at the ways that we can use single session and brief short-term therapy to increase accessibility of service to students. A big piece comes up around possible barriers and questions of equity. So particularly around, let's say, for example, a student comes in and they have moderate to high anxiety symptoms, and it takes a lot for them to come in, and then we're asking them to, do the next steps and then walk back in to do a follow-up. There's sometimes questions around, is that the best way to approach the situation? Could we just book the follow-up? There's also the piece around equity, around staff kind of picking and choosing how they're following the model. So some of us are, maybe following the model to a T, and there's others that are a bit more flexible. So sometimes that does bring up a question around equity. So it really depends on who the student might encounter in terms of whether they have a follow-up or whether they're asked to come back after the next steps sheet. Some of the successes, so there's clear expectations communicated to students. So Lori had mentioned in our old model, students would come in for an intake, and then they were given a number of sessions, and we weren't necessarily giving out the number of sessions that each student was eligible for. So now it's much more clear, and I think it also manages expectations from the student as well. Minimal to no wait lists, and this is reduced a lot of stress and pressure and burnout for staff. Use of scales. So I've been here at SCD for 2 years, and in my time prior to this model, I don't think we were using any scales. So it's been a welcomed addition, and it because you get to use the scale in the session. It's something that you can bring out and engage the student with in terms of understanding their presenting issues. Sometimes students might find it hard to speak to, let's say, harm to self. So in the scale, it does include that, and it helps us to understand what the student might be dealing with. works well for students with mild symptoms or situational presenting issues. So students with mild symptoms of anxiety, or let's say there's a piece around, I had a panic attack during an exam. So it's something that really helps to contain the presenting issue in the moment. Part of the model is our evaluation form, and I think since the implementation of this of our model, we've had very high ratings, and this has really helped with staff morale.
Okay, so hi everyone. This is Stephanie speaking. I'm just going to talk about some of the outcomes that we've noticed, which Lori and Fatima have already previously discussed. So the one thing that we're very proud of is the shorter wait time. So as Lori was mentioning earlier, rather than having to wait 7 to 10 days for your first real appointment, you are typically seen within half an hour to an hour. We also have a huge reduction in the wait list, which you'll also see on the following slides, as well as fewer students in crisis. And so regarding the third point there, we've hypothesized for a long time as a department, what is the reason for such the big drop in crisis appointments. And we had our colleagues over in communications who just scour the web generally for any feedback or people posting to forums. If anyone here today is familiar with Reddit, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, I mean, we do get some feedback from communication sometimes, and we've actually seen evidence of students talking to their peers online saying, if you want to be seen right away, just say you're in crisis, maybe shed a few tears, that's how you'll really be taken seriously. And so again, we didn't want our students to be doing that, to have to get same-day service, and that's one of the reasons why I think walk-in counseling was also very welcome from the student body. So this is a slide on comparing our models. You'll see that we have the historical intake model in the column on the left and the pilot walk-in model on the right. The first row there just talks about the dates that these models were in operation, so prior to December 2018 onwards. But the dates that we're using for the comparative analysis are more so, well, they had to be similar so that we could somehow compare how we were doing. And so you can see that we did a sample of the last 3 months before we made the change to the pilot walk-in, and then the first 3 months after we changed to the pilot walk-in. So in regards to same-day service, none versus averaging, at that time we were seeing 12 students a day. Wait time until the first session, 7 to 10 days versus 30 minutes. The number of students on the wait list who have yet to receive service, 125 versus 38. The asterisk there being we had one of our colleagues move to work at another location. She actually left the institution completely, and so that number of 38 actually includes a small inflation of 16 students whom that counselor had to put on the wait list because she was no longer here. In terms of our wait time average, we've gone from 74 days waiting on the wait list to an average of 15 days. Wait time median, 68 days to 12 days. And then, like I mentioned, with the number of crisis sessions, we had 224 within those 3 months sampled prior to the switch. And then after the switch, we had 17 within 3 months. So again, a very big and welcome change in that regard. We also continue to collect data as, of course, the year or the months rolls on, and hopefully as the years roll on as well. So here you can see the data for September 2019, October 2019, and November 2019 to date. You can see from our total walk-in sessions that we had 267 in September, 330 in October, and 257 in November. We look at the average walk-ins per day. So like Lori mentioned previously, we wanted to be able to project when our busy times were and be able to change the model if needed or make tweaks to it. So we collect data on average walk-ins. Similarly to the previous slide, the wait time until the first session, you can read for yourself there. The number of students on the wait list, again, so that refers to the people who are put on the wait list and not necessarily the people who are still waiting at the time of data collection. So you can see that on the following row, the wait time average was 5 days, 7.3 days, and 2.2 days respectively for each of the 3 months, meaning the people who are on the wait list usually cycle off within or before the 1 week mark comes up. I did want to make an extra note here that some different factors account for why we might see the range in the wait time. So 0 to 9 days, 1 to 21 days, or 0 to 5 days. So just really quickly to list a few, if a student is put onto the wait list on a Friday, then the 2 weekend days are accounted in the wait time. So that's not necessarily something that reflects poorly on the department, nor is it necessarily something we're looking to change by operating through the weekend, but it's just something to be mindful of. Our staff also have consultations on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, so if they're reviewing the waitlist during consultation on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, technically people who are put on Monday have a higher chance of being picked up sooner, and so forth. And then, of course, for different presenting issues and special requests made by students for a same-sex or same-gender identifying counselor can account for some of the range in the wait time as well. So some of the other stats we collect have to do with the wait time median, which again I've already discussed, the number of crisis sessions, frequent walk-ins, which refers to any student who comes for a walk-in session 3 or more times in the same semester, and then our top 3 presenting issues. Really, we collect all of our presenting issues. Just for the sake of this presentation, I've identified the top 3 there. We also collect a good amount of quantitative feedback from our students. So every student who comes to a walk-in session will be invited to fill out a walk-in feedback form. They are asked to rate us on a scale from 1 to 10, and so these are the averages that you see here, and the sample size you can see in yellow at the top there. And we also collect qualitative feedback, which would be on the same walk-in form. We had 93% positive feedback, again, in the sample size you see there. And in terms of any of the constructive criticism or the negative feedback, we always bring that back to our staff meetings just to share with staff. And we share the positive feedback too. I mean, we bring both and discuss how we can potentially, again, tweak our system to address some of the things that are mentioned as suggestions by our students. One of the things that we also did in terms of preparing for this fall semester, which would have been the first time we launched our the walk-in model not as a pilot, was we had our counselors arranged into different summer project groups, which were different areas that folks were interested in or had a passion for, just to develop some of the more holistic processes for a service delivery model in addition to the walk-in service. So like I mentioned, we had case consultation, we had clinical advisory for more robust policy development, we looked at website updates, we've looked at psychologists being able to conduct assessments where they can rule out a diagnosis, and we're partnering with another department on campus for that. We've done a lot of outreach for public presence on campus, and then again creating some skills workshops that we can invite students to obtain a lot of that psychoeducational support prior to needing ongoing counseling. And I would suggest if you're thinking about changing to a walk-in model, definitely survey your staff and canvass them and ask them about what topics or anecdotal changes they like to make, and hopefully that will help to support some of the change as well.
Okay, so the next few slides, I'm just going to be going over the an overview of the model. So essentially when students walk in, they enter into our office, they're met with the front desk reception, and they request to see a counselor. And so front desk, because this is fairly new for our students, if they've been here before, they'll clarify the changes to our services, and they'll explain that they can meet with an on-call counselor, and they're provided with the paperwork. So it's no longer the intake. They come in, they're met with reception, and they start that process to access the single session. So our walk-in counseling is offered between 9 to 3 p.m. Between 3 and 4 p.m. we can offer emergency support to students. If they're not in crisis or if it's not deemed an emergency, then they are asked to return the next day. And this is left up to the front desk to assess and to inquire about. And so essentially what we deem as an emergency are students who report harm to self or others, if there's been a recent sexual or physical assault, or if students are walked over by, let's say, a TA or someone from a different department. In an emergency support appointment, it can function like a single session, but we do a risk assessment, then we might book the person for a follow-up. So the walk-in session, if it's not an emergency, between the hours of 9 to 3, we carry on with the single session model. They may be referred to a number of different programs that we have, including Our process groups, our partnership program with Ontario Shores, so that's the CBT program that we offer out of our office. They may also be referred to the York Psychology class, so that's for students who might be struggling with their academics. So at the end of each single session, as mentioned, they receive their next steps sheet, and the idea is that they follow through, or they try to follow through with the recommendations on the next step sheet. So included in the next step sheets is the skills workshops or the bounce back videos. So both of these, the bounce back videos and the skills workshop, the idea is to provide students with skills. So we want to encourage them to learn skills to better manage stressors and to support their academic potential, or even like personal pieces that they might be struggling with. So the topics that are covered in the workshop situate around stress and understanding the impacts of stress and stress management techniques. The bounce back videos, they go into a CBT approach around managing anxiety, social anxiety. And we as a staff, we also developed journals, so worksheets that go along with the bounce back videos. So if a student, let's say if they're not able to attend a workshop, then we do recommend the bounce back videos and we email that to them. There's been many situations where I've referred students to both the workshop and the bounce back videos. And again, it's to really give this foundation of skills to learn some emotional regulation techniques. So that's usually included in the skills workshop, if it's clinically appropriate. So the idea after the student has completed their next steps sheets, included in that is the skills workshop or the bounce back videos. If they feel that they need further counseling support, then they will we ask them to walk back in and ask for a follow-up. And they'll meet with the on-call counselor who will review the next steps sheets with them and discuss updates or any pieces around their presenting issues. And that's where we would assess for a fit for short-term counseling. Big change to our model, aside from the single session, is the implementation of the short-term therapy, so 6 to 8 sessions. And the idea is to really work on developing counseling goals and to support students in meeting these goals within the 6 to 8 session model. Now, there are exceptions to that, and we want to meet students where they're at. So if, let's say, a student is experiencing a recent trauma, then we would obviously make exceptions to that approach. We use the PHQ and the GAD. So if, let's say, a student has returned for a follow-up 2 weeks after their initial session, we would administer the scales again, just to get an idea of their scoring and their rating. And then we would implement the scales again during their last session to understand any shifts or improvements that have been made, or if there hasn't been any shifts, because that would speak to maybe the plan around referrals or where they might need to continue to get support. The idea is that after the student has received their 6 to 8 sessions, that we close the file ideally at the end of each semester or earlier, if possible. And then we have our own process in terms of how we close our files, and that's part of our working model as well.
So just a few more important pieces to our service delivery. We implemented clinical consultations, so our counselors are divided into teams of 2, and half the team meets on Tuesday morning and half the team meets on Wednesday morning. So, and that's to discuss those exceptions that Fatima was talking about in terms of clients that might need to go beyond the 6 or 8 sessions, or if they're looking for support from their colleagues. It's also where we discuss the wait list, so that we're making sure we're constantly aware of who's on the wait list and how many. And that's also where we would discuss those clients that have come in multiple times for a single session. Another big change, and this was a pet peeve of the clinicians here, was how many students, particularly around exam time, were coming in looking just for letters. So we certainly noticed a pattern at certain times of the year where students would sit through a session, not be really present in the session, and then say, hey, could I get a letter? So we're very clear up front on our website and messaging at the front desk and on our next step sheet that we don't provide letters for walk-in sessions. We do support petitions and things, but that comes from ongoing relationships. We also looked at starting an assessment partnership, which is sort of an aside, but it's also another big change to our model. Our psychologists are now providing some assessment and diagnosis support to academic accommodation services. So. And you'll see the gray bar there. We are committed to evaluating our service, which we do on an ongoing basis. Just again, we highlight some of those part of our step care program, I guess you could say, or our referral, or one of the ways that we deal with not having so many people on the wait list is we really refer heavily to the support groups and process groups that we offer.
Okay, so this is Stephanie again. We're going to try to get folks out on time, and but we also wanted to provide as much and hopefully as really useful information to you folks. So again, if you do have to hop off, the slides will be provided to you after the presentation. I'm just going to talk a little bit about data collection here. We really do this, for a variety of reasons, but the top two that I could think of is to gain insight into how we can contribute to continuous improvement, and also to effectively communicate to our stakeholders, whether it's reporting upwards into the hierarchy or reporting horizontally to our other campus partners or off-campus partners as well. So on a lot of the following slides, you'll just see examples of the data that we collect. I got a question from Janine asking about what percentage of students access one-to-one counseling. I wouldn't be able to comment on that off the top of my head, but it's certainly something that we can pull after the presentation and take a look at. When it comes to data collection, the first priority is to make sure that everybody understands what's being collected and for what purpose. So again, there aren't, everything is as transparent as possible. And then once you have a clean data set, you're able to kind of make those analyses for a certain given period of time or for a particular service. So this is just an example of a type of report that we might run. So for different years and for different months, what is our demand? And of course, right at any given time, you can include cancellation rates or no-show rates, or you can exclude them depending on what the data is being pulled for. And yeah, so it's really flexible as long as you do that upfront work of keeping it clean. This is just a different way of looking at this same data we previously presented. And as Lori mentioned, our peak times really are in October, November, and February and March. And this data helped us to determine that it would be a good idea to have walk-in counselors, also referred to as casual staff, during those peak times. So yeah, I already talked about this. Flexibility and real-time data means that we can be more responsive to student need. Again, just a bunch of different examples of data that we collect, many of which I believe we've already discussed. So the one thing, again, another thing to keep in mind, Lori talked about some of the challenges in terms of front desk staff playing a big role in our service delivery model. One of the ways in which I've presented the data collection procedure to staff at a staff meeting is by outlining all the different parts of the process and then encouraging everybody who plays a part in that step to do as best of a job they can, and again, making sure that data is clean. So I'm not going to go through all the different types of examples where we might see a potential error in the process, but it's just good to be mindful of what those might be, or what are some of the parts in your data collection process that might need to be tightened or might need looked at more often than others. Just some more examples of data we collect. So we have average clients per day. Again, some weekdays are busier than others. And at the bottom there, we have peak time. So again, some times are busier than others. Our top presenting issues, I think we have about 30 in total, and counselors record this as they go throughout their sessions. This also helps us to identify areas which we may, for instance, have another workshop in or create additional resources for. Some folks asked about the step care model. So We can talk a little bit more about that maybe during Q&A. But when it comes to the model that we have and the one that Fatima previously discussed, we're also doing our best to collect numbers on the referral streams that we send students to, whether they're in-house or on campus or off campus, and attach numbers to those so that we can see kind of what, or kind of guesstimate what baseline of knowledge our students have. Maybe they don't have something or they aren't aware of something, they go to the workshop and come back, and they are a little bit more aware of some of those, of some of the things that they would have previously had questions about. So you can see down at the bottom there that we recommend workshops to students. They might not necessarily go 100% of the time that they're recommended to go. And so that just speaks to what Fatima was previously talking about some staff being more flexible when it comes to the model and following up and saying, did you attend workshop? Whereas other staff may be a little bit more rigid in that regard. This slide here is just about data collection. And so we currently use the platform or software Clockwork. I think many folks do as well, at least in terms of the other campuses that I've spoken to. And so again, when it comes to collecting data, being really mindful of the labels that you're using and making sure that everybody is aware of what each labels represent. Sometimes data collection can be, or making it cleaner can be as simple as clarifying what labels are being used for what. And so this is a slide that was presented at one of our staff meetings. We talked about outdated labels, which I've highlighted in red. Labels that are still being used are either green or have no highlight, and green is what we're particularly looking at when it comes to data collection. So again, some things like lunch, not in office, admin are optional labels that staff may choose to use or may choose not to use. But again, when it comes to collecting data on referral processes and the types of sessions that we have on campus, that's really what is most important for us here. All right.
So I just mindful of the time, and I know you have a chance to look at the slides in your own time when we send them out, but you'll see here some of our milestones and then future developments. Again, without going through all of these, I will say that what we do is we are committed to evaluation on an ongoing basis, and so we look at all of the changes that we've made, and including we'll have a full year of our walk-in model at the end of this school year, and we will spend the summer going through those things again and reviewing what went well and other areas of improvement. So future developments, we're looking at new electronic medical records where we have approval for a nurse practitioner. So one of the things the model has allowed us to do is to take some time, and I know there's this sort of anecdotal theory that we need more counselors to better service our students. And I think some of the things that we're seeing when we take a step back under this model is that maybe it's not counselors necessarily that where our gaps are, but other areas. And for us, it's a nurse practitioner, it might be a case manager or something like that. So being really aware that it's not, the problem isn't always solved by more staffing in the counseling realm. Again, continue data collection and reviewing your staffing model and all of the programs you offer, just committing to evaluation around each and every one of them. And last but not least, I think I've said it before, again, this is Lori. I think, key takeaways is that under this model, I think to be successful, you have to have a dedication to continuous improvement. You need your staff to buy into the model, and it's really important that for me, it was to hear their voices and what was important to them, to be honest with them that change is hard, that you don't have all the answers, that you don't know. There's a lot of unknowns that I couldn't answer. But it's really about having a strong team and moving forward together and trusting each other and trusting in their clinical skill and trusting that we will make the right decisions based on the data guiding us. So some of those things are really important. Also, and Stephanie's very good at always reminding us we should always include the student and asking for their feedback in various means, whether it's surveys or going around talking to people in our waiting room, those kinds of things. And also the session outcome scales that we use at the end of every session. It talks about staff buy-in. So again, I can't say enough about this because the staff are obviously key to successful service delivery, and so including them in the process. So I don't know if they're, in a previous employment role, I would have had 4-hour staff meetings every day for 4 months, but I think in this case, it was really needed. It's no different than I see clinical relationships. It's those ruptures in relationships, the hard times, and the rebuilding again after going through a hard time that really creates a strong staffing team. And really, because I wanted their input and they needed to buy in, I laid it out on the table and really said, you don't like the way I'm doing it or what I'm suggesting, you tell me. And so, I presented a model to them, and then I went on vacation for 3 weeks while they were upset and talked about it and all of that. But they came back and said, okay, so here's what we think. And then we really went forward from there. Again, reception is part of our team. It's a very important part of this model, so they have to be considered, as well as your partners in the community. So all of that to say is I really feel proud of the work that the staff here have done. I can honestly say it is an amazing feeling to not have a wait list. I hope that my staff feel the same about that. I think they've got really good consultation teams, and we get really good feedback from our partners and from students. So I wish you luck if you choose to follow a similar path.
Yeah, awesome. So we are, that takes us to the end of our presentation. If you need to go, feel free to do so. If you wanted to stay and ask a few questions, Fatima, Lori, and myself will be here for, I don't know that we have anything booked this afternoon, maybe 5 to 10 minutes. Yeah, at least one of the three of us will be here for the next 10-20 minutes. So yeah, feel free to ask away in the chat, and we'll be happy to answer.
Thank you so much, guys. I just want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the great work that you've done. It's not easy to pull this off. So I just want to really, really thank you for the work that you've done and for being willing to share it with the rest of us as well.
Questions are coming fast and furious. There was a question about stepped care. I don't know that I would, I feel comfortable saying that we follow, I think what, Peter Cornish's step care model to a T. I will say that some of those partnerships that Fatima had mentioned earlier, so when a student comes in to walk in, and they complete that PHQ and GAD, we use that as a way to know whether they're appropriate referrals. So for instance, we have 2 clinicians from Ontario Shores. We have a partnership with Ontario Shores Hospital in Whitby. 2 of those clinicians are here on site. They're not my staff. They're actually the staff of the hospital. They offer a 16-week CBT program for anybody in the mild moderate range. So we use those scales to know whether it's an appropriate referral. So they take about 30 referrals from us per semester, which again is a way to work to sort of shift off your own wait list to be able to offer a longer term counseling, but it is a very specific manualized CBT model. So the client really needs to know that's a good fit. When that referral is made at that first walk-in session, they are no longer our client. It's a referral, goes out to the hospital, they take it over, and the file is closed, even though those staff are on site for us. So I think if you're looking at ways to address the wait list, it's finding creative ways to have partnerships with the community as well.
We have a question from Susan about seeing this model as a promising practice. So I can comment a little bit about that. I don't know that the current model that we have is something that we've developed for our particular population, and certainly while we encourage you to take what you think might fit for your population, and you're more than welcome to do so. I also don't think that the quote unquote best model will look the same, right, at any given place. And so the first point that you see there in final takeaways, continue service delivery. It doesn't say, you know, final takeaways, make sure you implement walk-in as soon as possible. We do want to recognize, similarly to how we do with clients and students, that every location and case might be different, but I do think that there are some core tenets of our current model and the things that we value that are promising or best practices. And so going back to valuing evaluation, being very responsive to student need and making sure that we're collecting the right data to support that. I definitely think that those are promising practices. Lori talked a lot about staff buy-in, as did Fatima, and so one of the slides that I showed earlier that walked through the data collection process and any potential errors was something that I, as a supporting staff, but not necessarily a clinician, kind of learned through my experience here, is that, you know, sometimes you might show data that you think supports a certain business operation decision or certain management decision, but you might have some of your staff saying to you, you know, I don't agree with that number, how did you get it? So then, you know, you have to think about being more transparent about the process in which you gathered that data. Or you might have somebody say to you, I don't even think that's the right figure to look at if we wanted to support a certain business operation. So again, bringing as much clarity and transparency to why you're doing what you're doing and how you're collecting information to substantiate what you're doing, I would definitely say is always a good practice to have.
So there was a question by Susan, if we just scroll up. Mm-hmm. So, no,
We've addressed all of these throughout the presentation, I believe.
What, if anything, keeps you awake at night since implementing the model? So that was a question that really caught my eye. So I can just speak as a clinician that in terms of the single session, not really, because I think that if I meet a student who is in crisis or if there's something that's of imminent concern, then I know that I will do whatever is best for the client and whatever is most clinically appropriate. And Lori is supportive of that, and we have inclusion of exceptions when it is appropriate. I think it's actually helped to have looking at the single sessions as something that is empowering to the students, and it can actually be helpful if students do follow up the next steps, and that's something that you pull into the sessions. I know for myself at this stage in our model, an adjustment for me has been more so moving towards 6 to 8 sessions, but single sessions I think have been really great. Yeah.
So I just, I don't know whether there was a specific question. Somebody asked something about how many one-on-one sessions. So I think a surprise for me, and when we went back to the literature to look at what research supports these kinds of models, I made a bit of an assumption that about 75% of students would utilize the single session, and then the rest of that remaining 25% would be sort of dealt with in ongoing. So at first there was a lot of concern about shortening to 6 or 8 sessions and wait lists and things like that. But what we soon realized was that, in fact, the number of students that come in for the single session and don't come back is closer to 90%, which really opens up the caseloads of your counselors. It gives them some breathing room, but it also, even though we have that 6 or 8 session model, should those exceptions need to be made where clients need to be seen longer or there are more complex cases, it really it gives the counselors the ability to actually have that time to do those kinds of things. So that was a really big surprise for us, and it may just be unique to the York population. But I think, you know, if you're interested, 90% of our students are here on the one session. The other thing that was interesting, we really thought we'd have a lot more frequent flyers, or what Stephanie said is the clients coming back for more than 3 sessions a semester. So out of the 800 clients we've seen from the data that Stephanie pulled, we had 15, I believe, was the number of most frequent flyers. Again, those files then come to the consultation groups to sort of say, are we missing something? Have we, you know, is there a recommendation we can make? Maybe the student really needs to be in ongoing. But that was a surprise for me too. I thought we'd have a lot more frequent flyers. So those are some really interesting statistics. The other thing that we just looked at yesterday was ongoing cancellation and no-show rates for ongoing counseling. And what's been interesting is from the historical model to this new walk-in model, the rate of about 30% cancellation and no-show has remained stable. So it continues to be the same under the ongoing counseling, those clients that we do offer ongoing inside this walk-in model. So that's something I have to sort of wrap my head around about how to revisit that. But part of our reasoning for offering students asking them to do the next steps, go away and come back once they've done that, was to really kind of get a bit of a sense of buy-in too, that students were now committed and ready to do that ongoing. But it hasn't sort of played out that way because the cancellation no-show rate is stable. So interesting, and something where I'll have to put on the table for future thought.
So Doug Stringer asks, would you say that clinicians are more directive and prescriptive in asking students to complete steps before returning? So, I mean, it really depends on the student's presenting issue, and it really depends on the clinician, but I can say, based on my own experience and with discussions with my colleagues in our consultation meetings, that no, where we really try not to be, and what we tell students is do the next step sheets, or at least try, because when they come in for the follow-up, what happens is that the next step sheet is reviewed with the on-call counselor. So if there's something that is not followed up, it's an opportunity to discuss that with the counselor. And it also might help to speak to maybe some further challenges or areas that the client or the student might want to work on in terms of goals or areas where they need development. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there might be some pieces that are directive, like go to the workshop, and there's other pieces that are utilizing and bringing in mindfulness. So notice when anxiety comes up, or be mindful when stress or that inner critic, that voice comes up. So we try, I know for myself and my colleagues that we meet with in our meetings, our consultation meetings, that we do try to stay away from that.
Welcome. Yeah, you're welcome. So it looks like people are running out of questions, but I also want to say that we obviously, you can have the slides, but we are open to answering questions. Again, Fatima, I really wanted Fatima to be here because I think it's important that people know that there's what it feels like from both a management perspective and a staff perspective to make these adjustments. And then of course Stephanie being here represents the data piece, and that's the guiding principles to which we make these decisions. So please feel free to contact us personally after this if you have ongoing questions, or you want clarification or any of those kinds of things. But I really appreciate people taking the time to listen, and I like it. It's really an honor for me to be able to talk about this model because, again, I'm really proud of the work that's happened here and the changes that we've made.
All right, so I guess. Sorry, Stephanie, were you about to say something?
No, that's it. Go ahead.
Okay. I think it's just feedback from my. So I think we'll just wrap up now. And again, once again, thank you so much to all of you, Lori, Stephanie, and Fatima. Really appreciate you sharing your work here. And thank you to everyone who attended the webinar. So just so you know, tomorrow an email is going to go out with the slides as well as the recording of the webinar in case you want to share it with your colleagues. And with that, we are going to end the webinar. And as I'm going to end the webinar, a short survey is going to pop up. So please leave your thoughts for how you felt this webinar went. I'm sure it was excellent, but it would really help us to organize our webinars in the future if you fill out that short survey. All right, have a wonderful day, everyone, and thank you again to our speakers.